On the side of the private sector, the responsible use of technology is something that sometimes is not at the top of their agenda. So the first thing is to engage the private sector, especially big technology companies and also small technology companies, because we are seeing in Latin America quite a bit of startups that are working with artificial intelligence. The right framing of how to use artificial intelligence is super important. And since I'm talking about the right framing, let me go to the government for a moment. Mostly when we talk about artificial intelligence, we end up talking about regulations. But it turns out that regulation, it's something that takes time, and that in new areas such as technology, especially artificial intelligence, companies and the private sector know more and go ahead of what government can do. So there's three things that need to be done with the private sector. First of all, work with them to act on self-regulation. That is to say, what they are willing and capable of doing to be responsible and to be ethical. The second one, it's probably talk about standards. What kind of standards? And standards are not self-regulation; they're externally defined, but they are not necessarily heavy top-down regulations. They're something that you voluntarily do. And since I mentioned startups, because not all the big technology companies that we have today are going to be the big technology company of the future, we need to talk about how we can certify what they are doing in the use of the technology that actually would make a responsible use of technology. The big framing here is that we're talking about education, health, social protection, poverty, inclusion. These are issues that are very close to what our citizens now are asking to look at. Artificial intelligence is a great opportunity, but if we don't look at the responsible use of artificial intelligence, we're missing an opportunity. From the Inter-American Development Bank, our main focus now is not necessarily go in a conversation about regulation, but rather to use cases. You can call it pilots or applications, but applications that involve the government, the big technology companies and the small technology companies, and we are working also to triangulate that conversation. Some examples. For example, teenage pregnancy, a prevalent issue in Latin America. One of the main causes of school dropout in Latin America, which is actually 50% of our school kids would not finish secondary education. Teenage pregnancy is one of the main topics. So there's some companies and governments that are working together to have predictive models to be able to anticipate the possibility of a teenage becoming pregnant and dropping out of school. That's perfectly okay, and that's a very promising area. But there's a but, which is how do you do that in an ethical, responsible way? If you make a mistake in one of these areas, you can call teenage pregnancy, school dropout, even early diagnosis of retinopathy. If you make a mistake there, you might mark a human being for the rest of their lives. So that needs to be clearly defined. So these things are happening in Latin America today. We're working in models to predict this, but we're trying to be responsible in the conversation. Responsibility means essentially, Santiago, that we know about the algorithm and how it's defined. We have public policies that are aligned to that algorithm. And of course, the issues of privacy and cybersecurity are on top of that. I'm not envisioning that we will have one standard, one ethical standard, or that we will have an agency regulating ethical standards. I think that the communal construction of what ethical happens in it's not only for technology, by the way, it happens in everything that we do. So what you will see slowly but surely is the combination of standards, self-regulation, regulations from the government, creating an ethical conversation. But perhaps the most important message is this is not a top-down exercise. This is something that it needs to be constructed from the bottom up. And that means essentially talking to people, seeing what they want, and understanding what their capacity to actually understand what the model, in the case of artificial intelligence, it's either predicting or, more frightening sometimes, prescribing. Because eventually artificial intelligence can prescribe policies. Who's going to be validating those?